All right, I'm back. Now, this is the third of the videos on Jerusalem, and we're tracing the history, and it's really important. I'm getting a little tired of hearing my own voice, and you're probably a friend who can be touched with the feeling of that infirmity. But here we go. Last time, remember the video one, we looked at the geography: two hills, three valleys, bordering hills, and so on, various stages. Last one, I took you through the biblical history, all the way from the patriarchs through the close of the New Testament and up through the Roman period. Now, I want us to focus on what I'm calling here post-biblical eras. I need to turn my pen on here. So, as I say here, post-biblical eras up to modern Israel. So basically from the apostolic day until the 20th century. And we're going to do the same thing, kind of a special focus. Now, here's where we've been. I'm going to rehearse it real quickly. It may be a little while since you saw that last video. But again, this is the biblical era, starting with the Canaanite way back here with before Joshua. And then again, here, the conquest and settlement. Joshua comes, settles the land, the period of the judges. Jerusalem is still Jebus. And then the monarchy, Saul, David, Solomon, the united monarchy during Saul's reign as king. His capital is Benjamin. Jebus is a Canaanite city. Then David captures Jebus, hugely important, brings the ark up. Solomon builds a temple and extends the city to the north. Then you have the divided monarchy, beginning with Hezekiah, who extends the walls to the western hill, digs the Hezekiah's tunnel. And then again, the surviving, this is when you have only the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom now below that area now is ruled by Assyria, but you've got Davidic kings down to the south. And actually, what am I talking about? I missaid that. The divided kingdom is when you've got Jerusalem to the south and Samaria is the capital of the north. And it's when the kingdom is when the northern kingdom is carried off in 722 that you have the surviving kingdom. And here is where you have Hezekiah extending the city. And Jerusalem survives until 586. And then they are in exile when Jerusalem and the temple are rubble. And then Ezra and Nehemiah, as well as the book of Esther, but that's sort of a flashback that happens back in Persia. But the restoration period where they build the second temple, remember this terminology, it's Solomon who builds the first temple, and that's going to be destroyed in 586. And it's Zerubbabel who builds the second temple, which is going to be hugely improved by Herod, but then it's going to be destroyed in 70 AD. So you have the intertestamental period. First of all, Persia allows them to return. Greece, divided four ways. The Seleucid abuses, the Hasmonean or Maccabean revolution. Now they have independence until Rome deputizes Herod to take control. He does. Herodian Jerusalem, of course, his second temple, he remodels it hugely. And then in 70 AD, the temple is destroyed, and the Romans begin to persecute Christians. You have a series of 10 persecutions up until about 330, when it might have been a quarter to four, I like to say. No, about 330 AD, when a Roman emperor, Constantine, converts. So let's pick it up there. So Roman rule, we talked about this last time, beginning with Herod, going through Constantine, Jerusalem enlarged and enriched by Herod, the early churches there, and so on. You have this Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot. The Bar Kokhba revolt was more ugly than, that is, the reprisal that Rome visited upon Jerusalem, upon the Jews of Israel, is almost beyond imagining. But very important, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian, who puts it down, rebuilds Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina. That's the city we're going to be walking around in. And for 300 years, you have persecution. Now, we come now to the Byzantine period. This is a new period. We are focusing on the time between the New Testament and the 20th century. And the Byzantine period is so named because, as I said, an emperor by the name of Constantine converts. Constantine, remember this guy. He moves his capital to Byzantium, Istanbul, Constantinople, and thus it's referred to as the Byzantine period. The important point is that now, for about 300 years, the Roman Empire is officially Christian. Now, it wasn't Christian in a New Testament sense. It wasn't Christian in a way that you and I would be very happy with. And quite frankly, the gospel was not better served by reason of the fact. But that's for another time. The fact is that now Christians, it's you have to become Christian to have any standing in the empire. And but 2 points to be made. Number one, the Jews are much persecuted. The Byzantine Christians were basically very anti-Jewish. And this is a time of great trouble and persecution for the Jews, even though the Christians, they're building churches, they're having pilgrimages, they're calling councils, they're defining doctrines and so on. The Christians are, but they are very much troubling the Jews. And the other point to be made, and this is not in terms of, the grand sweep of history, very important, but it's just history. It's important to our trip, is that Constantine's mother, whose name was Helena, remember this gal, she sets out to recover Christian holy places. And she is going to discover, we believe, the place where Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected. It's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. She is going to recover all sorts of Bethlehem. She's going to build a church in Bethlehem over the cave where Jesus. Now, again, this is in the early 300s, so a lot of history has gone by. And during those history, there's been a great deal of persecution. But handily enough, one feature of that persecution is that the Romans, especially Hadrian, very early on, have built monumental shrines and temples and so on over significant Christian and Jewish holy places. So what's the best key? What's the best hint as to where they are? All becomes very important. All right, so that's the Byzantine period. Get used to it. We'll talk about it. And I like to say, basically, it's from 300 to 600. From 300 to 600, the Roman period is basically through 300. And then the Byzantine period, as I say, is 300 to 600. Now, it's not exact. 638, we'll talk about it, is when the Muslims show up. But 300 years when Christianity was the official religion and huge churches were being built and so on. Now, I give you this much about the Byzantine period. I think I'll not go through it. I've gone over it pretty well. But, one very quickly. There is a very interesting interruption when an emperor by the name of Julian the Apostate, had decided to paganize, to revert to the ancient Greco-Roman religion, to abandon Christianity, and he ordered the temple rebuilt, and there was a very, very brief time of huge hope on the part of the Jewish people, and they generated a lot of income and so on, but he was killed within a year. And with him died the hopes of that generation, and they reverted to Christianity. That is the Roman Empire once again. So the 300 to 600, the Byzantine, Rome is, as it were, officially. A lot of times this era is called Christendom. And in my mind, and maybe this isn't very formal, it's the kingdom, a Christian kingdom. Is Rome having been Christianized, but it's not real Christianity by any means. As a matter of fact, it becomes the enemy very early on of real Christianity. All right, so now this page, and again, it's page 20, I believe, of your notes that you can download. You should download. You should have these in front of you. But the fact is that the Byzantine period comes to an end toward the close in the 600s, early 600s. Well, actually, the point is, I tell you here about a very important map, a mosaic map that was laid down with over 2 million little tessera pieces and so on in a church in Jordan, just south of Amman, and that was discovered in 1884. But at any rate, the point is that the Byzantine glory of Israel and of Jerusalem specifically began to fall under the attack of Arab conquerors. And first of all, there were Persians, Zoroastrians, who in 614 came sweeping through, and they destroyed almost everything. We'll talk about this. But then the Jerusalem was able to the Byzantine, the Christian Romans, the Byzantines, were able to recapture the city of Jerusalem in 629, but they were worn out, and therefore, and here is that Medaba map, by the way. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Here, on this Medaba map from about somewhere in the late 500s, early 600s, notice that you have, now it was the whole land of Israel, and much of it was destroyed, but Jerusalem was in the center of it, and it's it was preserved quite happily. And notice what you have here. This is not so much Herodian Jerusalem at all as it is Aelia Capitolina. Because here's your Cardo, and can you see these? These are pillars, because of Cardo, the heart of the city, the north-south main heart of the city, the road, would be bordered on each side, be these columns. We'll see this in the shops and so on as a marketplace. And there was a secondary Cardo here. Then there is a road that doesn't make it onto here called the Decumanus, but there are several important churches, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of Saints, it's the Pool of Bethesda up in, not Bethesda, the Five Porched Pool up in, to the north of the Temple Mount. Here is the Church of Zion, which remembers the upper room and so on. So not all that interesting. Suffice it to say that, so the Byzantine period comes to an end in 638. I don't think, because what happened in it's in the next slide. All right, very simply, the Byzantine Christians ruled for about 300 years. Late in the 500s, early 600s, they began to grow very weak in Jerusalem. The Persians took control for a time, destroyed everything. The Byzantines were able to gain it back, Jerusalem, but they were spent. And so now, very importantly, in 638, we come to the first Muslim period. And I will say, I'll say this later, but let me just say it now just to make it simple, that really from about 638 until 1917, that's the end of the First World War, this land was under some permutation of Arab, Muslim, Turkish conquerors. Now, sometimes they were Arab Muslims, sometimes they were Turkish Muslims, some they were Zoroastrians, but some permutation of this combination, these factors. And number one, Jews were horribly, horribly mistreated, persecuted, slaughtered. And number two, the land was absolutely stripped bare and left in the most awful desolation. By the time you get here to 1917, now we're into the 20th century, next lecture, the land has just been decimated. That's very important. So what I'm saying is that, now wait, I gotta interrupt myself here. From 638 to 19, this is just kind of the simple way to handle this. I'm gonna break it down a little further. But from 638, that's when the Muslims showed up and ran the Byzantine Christians out of Jerusalem, took control of Jerusalem. And by the way, when they did, these Muslim invaders, after Muhammad had invented Islam religion just a few decades earlier, when they, not less than that actually, when they showed up, the Jewish people in Jerusalem treated them as deliverers, because the Byzantine Christians had been so destructive of the Jews, so persecuted the Jews, that they were actually happy to see the Muslims show up because well, they were, I don't know. But at any rate, because they treated them better than the Christians did. But here's my point, and it's a simple point. I want you to get it. From 638 to 1917, the land of Israel, and Jerusalem specifically, was under the heel of some permutation of Arab, Muslim, Turkish rulers, except for a very brief time from 1099 to really 1187, and these are the Crusades. I'm going to talk about it in just a minute, but just get this. For all of these hundreds of years, 638 to 1917, Israel, Jerusalem is basically under Muslim rule. So the first period we call the first Muslim period, and again, followers of Muhammad take Jerusalem in 638. As I say here, the Jews welcome Muslim invaders because delivered them from the Christian persecutors. So now Jerusalem is in the hands of Muslim until the Crusaders show up. I'll talk about it. And it becomes increasingly anti-Jewish and anti-Christian. Now, here are some notes on the, oh, I'm sorry, this shouldn't be here. I took it out of another. But this is the first Muslim period, 638 to 1099. 1099 is the first crusade. Crusades, of course, are attempts by European, British Christians or the denominations, the churches and so on, primarily the Catholic Church, to drive the Muslims out of. The Muslims had captured and desecrated all sorts of Christian holy places, and so it was an attempt to put a stop to it. But that's next. First Muslim period from 638 to 1099, and this is where I talk about the fact that Persia had been pushing back. They controlled the land for a short while. The Byzantines were able to capture it back. But in 636, the Arabian prophet Muhammad defeated the Byzantine army at the river of Yarmouk, and now they invaded. And in 638, Jerusalem fell to the Muslims. And so the Jerusalem now is under Muslim control. And basically that obtains until, as I say, the Crusades. Now, the Crusader period, again, there was this horror and legitimate horror. I'm convinced that there's a connection between this and the Thyatiran letter in the book of Revelation. And they're commended for taking up sword in defense, but they did it wickedly. So the Pope calls European Christians, as it were, to free the holy city, Jerusalem, from the infidel Muslims, and the knights march off to Jerusalem. Horrible abuses. One of the issues is these knights made no logistic preparation. They just set out, and they would gather, more armor and more soldiers along the way, and they had to survive. And so what they would do is they would fall on Jewish villages and just sack Jewish communities and villages and rape and destroy and murder and carry off their spoil to get them to the next Jewish village. It was horrible. But the point is that they are able to temporarily take Jerusalem, the Crusaders are, but in 1187, now you'll often see this, either the Crusades go from 1099 to 1187 or to 1291. The reason is because in 1187, there's a huge battle. We'll pass the battlegrounds at the Horns of Hattin, where the Crusaders are defeated. There is no more effort. There are no more battles. But a few Crusader knights and so on have settled in, and they make peace with some of the Muslims, and they're able to live in the land until 1291. And then an Egyptian family of Arabs by the name of the Mamluks come, and they just totally drive the Crusaders out of the land, and they destroy the port cities because they don't want any foreign invaders to take over anymore. So really, the Crusades themselves, the battle happens 1099, about just under 100 years, ends at the Horns of Hattin. But then there are Crusader presence yet in the land until 1291, and then it's destroyed. And here I talk about the Crusades, and I tell you pretty much what I just told you, but more details and so on. But suffice it to say, it was noble in its motivation, I believe, but in all of its parts and in bottomless dimensions, ignoble in its actual performance. What they actually did was horribly wicked. So after the Crusader period comes the second Muslim period, and this again I'm going to date from 1187 because now the Muslims are entirely in charge. And again, this is what I said earlier, some permutation of Arab, Muslim, Turkish rule. Jews are tolerated as they're under what's called dimitude, where they're second-class citizens, and they have to step off the sidewalk, and they pay a huge annual tribute, and they're horribly persecuted, and they are reduced to unspeakable squalor and poverty and so on. And now this is interesting. This happened in 1517. I'll give you the next page. I'm going to go here. You have, first of all, the Muslims control. And then, this is fascinating, in 1517, now folks, what else happened in 1517 on October 31st? So it's just interesting that the Reformation we date from 1517, and we will be celebrating the 500th year. Some will be more zealous in their celebration than perhaps I will, but But there will be great celebration of the Reformation for the next year because it's the 500th year anniversary. It's also the 500th anniversary of the Turks taking control of Jerusalem and Israel. And so, and actually, this is going to go until 1917, exactly 400 years. 1517, just so happens, is the year that the Turks from up north, Turkey, that area up north, were able, not the Arabs from down south, but the Turks. That's why I say you get this permutation of some Arab, some Turkish. But now the Turks take over, and they're going to rule until the end of the First World War. They choose the wrong side in the First World War, and they are defeated with Germany and the Axis powers and so on. And so the Allies take the land that had been controlled by the Ottoman Turks for 400 years and divide it up and make it Jordan and Saudi Arabia and so on. So just know, and ultimately Israel, and that's where the fight is today. So the point is, now the Turks are in charge of the Ottoman Turks, and one of the greatest, and he was a great ruler and a great administrator. His name was Suleiman, and he's the guy who builds these walls we're always talking about. I'll give you more about it. So the Jews are allowed to move back, but then they're treated horribly, poorly, and then very important, during the latter days of the Ottoman Turkish rule. Now we're getting up to the 20th century. We're getting up to modern history. We're getting close to the series of events which is going to eventuate in the birth of the State of Israel in 1948. But from 1517 to 1917, Ottoman Turkish rule. Late in that period, because of persecution in Europe, Jews begin to emigrate to Palestine. And by the way, during this time, that's what it's called. It's called Palestine. I think I talked to you about that name before. It was actually given this land by Hadrian because he wanted to obliterate memories of Israel, so he called it Philistia. And it was, when it was given, it was a deliberately pejorative and destructive name. But in the passage of time, it just became what you call this area. So they were emigrating to Palestine. It is at this point in the 1800s, early 1900s, up until the 1970s, it is entirely a geographic denomination. It has nothing to do with people's origin. The Jews who lived in Israel at this time were called the Palestinian Jews. The Arabs who lived there were called the Palestinian Arabs. All of its political overtones developed late in the 20th century. But anyway, to go back to it, you have great amount of what's going to be born here, and I tell you about it some, but in the late 1880s, you have an influx of European powers who are opening churches and so on. You have the anti-Semitism that erupts in the pogroms of 1881 and 82. This is the Fiddler on the Roof. And the author, a man by the name of Leon Pinsker, writes a book called Auto-Emancipation, in which he says, I'll read it to you right here, a stranger everywhere, wanted nowhere, having no home of his own. The only salvation would be the creation of a Jewish nationality living upon its own soil. It says here Zionism was born. This is Zionism. Understand what it means. Zionism is a political movement that was begun in the late 1800s, whose sole desire and purpose and goal was to establish in Palestine, in their ancient homeland, to establish a Jewish state to which Jews could flee for refuge, a Jewish state in their own homeland. That's Zionism. Now, there are a lot of dimensions to it and so on, but that's basically Zionism. And then very importantly, I give it to you here, so I'm going to mention it. In 1894, there was a trial of a Jewish French army officer who had been framed. His name was Alfred Dreyfus. And as he was being hauled off to Devil's Island, all along the way, the French crowds were screaming at him, not death to Dreyfus, but death to the Jews. And there was a young Jewish, totally assimilated Austrian journalist who covered that, was so alarmed that he wrote a book called The Jewish State, and he formally convened the first Zionist conference and really gave birth to Zionism, and that young man's name was Theodor Herzl. So now at the end of the 19th century, very beginning of the 20th century, there is this huge movement that is developing, fascinating, but this Zionist movement. And and that, by the way, takes you right up until the First World War. And as I said, the second Muslim period really ends in 1917 at the end of the First World War, when the victorious Allies disabused the Ottoman Turks of this territory and divided up into various lands, which gives us the ISIS struggle of today, and so on. All right, so here we are. This is our review. This gets us up to the 20th century. One more time. Canaanite, let's think about Jerusalem. Canaanite Jerusalem, up until Joshua comes, Moses' deliverance, Joshua conquers, the judges rule, but Jerusalem is still Jebus. Saul, his capital is at Gibeah. Jebus is a Canaanite stronghold. David takes Jebus. Solomon builds the temple up there north of Jebus. The monarchy is divided. Now Jerusalem is the capital of the southern kingdom, but the northern kingdom has its own capital, but then they're carried off, and you have the surviving kingdom. But during the surviving kingdom, a lot of Jewish refugees flee down. Hezekiah extends the walls to the western hill, builds the tunnel to bring the water over. But now the southern kingdom is destroyed in 586. They're in Babylon for 70 years, and the city is rubble, but now they're allowed to come back and rebuild the second temple under Zerubbabel, and then they rebuild the walls, and that's where the Old Testament comes to a close. I didn't mean to do that. So now the Old Testament comes to a close right here, but you have the intertestamental period. Persia allows them to return. The Greek Empire is divided after Alexander, and one of them, the Seleucids to the north, trouble the Jews, and there's a revolt. And now the Jews have independence until Rome shows up. Rome, of course, sends Herod to become king, and he establishes himself. But now you have Herodian Jerusalem. He rebuilds that second temple. So the Second Temple era begins before the Old Testament closes, actually. But the Second Temple, the Second Temple is remodeled hugely by Herod, and then you have the Roman period up to 330 when Constantine converts, and now you have Byzantine Christianity basically 3 to 600, and during that time the Roman Empire is ostensibly superficially Christian. Jews are being persecuted, churches are being built. Jerusalem is a very Christian city, but then, by the way, I should say, during the Roman period, early on in the Roman period, you have those two revolts. The first Jewish revolt, Zealot revolt, 66 to 70. Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed in 70 AD. Gets rebuilt. Hadrian decides to paganize the city. The Jews revolt. You have the second revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135. Now it's destroyed, rebuilt as Aelia Capitolina. That's the city we're going to visit. But then you have in 330 the conversion, about 330. He converts earlier than that, but in the Nicene Councils in 325. But when it becomes officially Christians, about 330, up until the Muslims show up. The Byzantine Christians, the Byzantine Romans have become very, very careless. Jerusalem is very weak. So now along come the Muslims, and they are able to control in 638. The Crusades come along in 1099. They try to take it back. They're unsuccessful. And so once again, the Muslims are in control from 1187 to 1917. And remember, the Turks come in 1517. That's the most recent before the 20th century. And it's 400 years. And it's during that time that, for instance, the Turks, and I mentioned this, one of the Turkish rulers puts a tax. During that period, during these Muslim periods, you have to understand that basically the land was owned by landowners who didn't live there. They were Arabs, Turks, whatever, who lived in Istanbul or Cairo or Damascus, and they had agents who came and administered the land, and you had these squatters who lived in total squalor, and as I say, the land was just stripped bare, and at one point the Turks put a tax on trees. They'd count the trees on your property and put a tax. Everybody went down, tore down their trees. Now the soil, of course, washes away. So the land was stripped bare during that time. But it was in 1917, into the First World War, that Turkish rule was was broken up, and this land was divided. That all that territory was divided between, the French got Lebanon, and various ones. The Brits got a lot of territory and so on at the end of the First World War, and that takes us into the 20th century. That's for the next time. All right, stay close. There will be more.